People love to imagine that having a billionaire for a dad means your whole life is smooth sailing. I'm Meredith, I'm 31, and I'm telling you right now, it looks nothing like the picture in your head. My father controls most of the expensive coastline in Georgia. He writes checks to politicians. The watch on his wrist is worth more than a lot of families will earn in a decade. And on the day I got married, in front of every guest in that room, he rose to his feet and deleted me from his life in a single line. No inheritance. No trust fund. My brand new husband, a man with engine grease worked into his knuckles, looked back at him and answered with just 4 words. The whole place went dead silent. My mother started her crying right on cue. But not one of those people had the faintest idea what my husband actually did for work, or what I'd been quietly putting together on my own while they all snickered behind my back. 7 months later, they'd find out in the worst possible way, up on a stage in front of 450 people, at the exact moment my father's empire couldn't survive it. If a story has ever pressed on something in you that never fully healed, then you're going to want to stay for this one. Tell me down in the comments where you're watching from. Let me carry you back to the dinner where my father slid an ultimatum across the table and told me it was love. It was a Thursday when it happened, at the long table with the giant windows facing the water my dad liked to pretend belonged to him. He didn't own the ocean. He owned the view, he owned the resort, and he owned most of the people eating with us. A bottle of vintage champagne sat breathing by his elbow. His watch flashed in the candlelight every single time he reached for another oyster, and he reached slowly, the way certain men do when they want to make you sit there and wait for them. "I've set up a meeting for you with Bennett Shaw this Saturday," he said, not even bothering to glance my way. "The Shaw merger is almost signed. It'd smooth everything over if people saw the two of you as a pair." I put my fork down. My grandfather taught me a long time ago that when you need to stay steady, you give your hands something small and quiet to do. So without even meaning to, I ran my thumb over the worn brass calipers I still keep in my bag, the ones Roy folded into my hand the year before he died. "I'm already with someone, Dad," I said. "And it's serious." That made him look up. "With who? What family is he from?" "You don't know him." The candle flames sputtered. My mother's smile hardened into something that looked ready to crack. My father set down the oyster he'd been enjoying and studied me the way he'd study a piece of property he'd already decided to pass on. "In this family," he said, "a marriage is a business deal. Feelings are for the people who can't afford a strategy." I didn't say Nathan's name. I didn't tell him that Nathan would never belong at a table like that one, and that I considered it the highest praise I had to give. I just smiled and let the quiet hang there, because some answers land better later in person, with a much bigger crowd watching. Naturally, he had me looked into. That was standard operating procedure in our family. 3 days after that dinner, I got called up to his office on the top floor of the main resort, the one where the glass runs floor to ceiling, and every chair is picked to make you feel 2 sizes too small. There was a thin folder waiting on his desk. "Nathan Reed," my father read out, flat as a contract. "Aircraft mechanic, leases a hangar at some regional airfield, no property, nothing you'd call assets, no family worth mentioning." He shut the folder and stared at me. "This is what you're blowing up the Shaw merger for, a guy who fixes engines that belong to other people. He's a good man. Good men don't build empires, Meredith. They get hired by the men who do." He stood and walked over to the window, hands clasped behind him. "Let me put it in plain terms so nobody's confused down the line. People with our name do not marry mechanics." I'd heard that same flatness before, years earlier, the day he refused to pay for my engineering degree, because he called it a cheap little hobby for a daughter like me. I paid for it on my own, taking classes at night and on weekends, building real things with my own hands while my sister got a debutante ball and a closet full of clothes. "You're the one who taught me to build things, Dad," I said, keeping my voice level. "So don't act shocked that I built a life you don't like." He laughed once, short and dry. There was one strange thing in that folder, though, and it stuck with me for weeks. The investigator had come up empty. No debts, no scandal, no messy history. For a man my father kept insisting was completely ordinary, Nathan's record was oddly, almost intentionally, spotless. And at the time, I couldn't figure out why. I'd met Nathan about 4 months before that, and not at some party. I met him on a job, which is honestly the only place I've ever felt fully like me. A regional airfield had brought in my firm to inspect the frame of an old hangar before they expanded it, and I spent a whole morning up in the trusses with a flashlight and a notebook. The place practically hummed. There's this sound a turbine makes when a jet powers up a couple bays over, a low rising whine you feel in your chest before your ears catch it, and I love it the way some people love a good song. A guy in coveralls was wiping down his hands near the doors, watching me measure a rusted-out gusset plate. The name stitched on his chest read Red Wing, an outfit I sort of recognized. "That plate's been fooling inspectors for 10 years, he said. "Tell me what you're seeing." So I told him. And instead of nodding along politely the way most men do, he pushed back. He was right twice, wrong once, and he actually owned up to the one he got wrong. We ended up talking for 2 hours. He asked me what I'd build if nobody was paying me and nobody was around to see it, which was a question not one person in my family had ever bothered to ask. He paid for our coffee in cash, a worn little fold of bills, and he steered us right past the fancy cafe down the street toward a diner with cracked vinyl booths. I noticed the pilots gave him a nod that seemed a touch too respectful for a regular line mechanic. I noticed it, tucked it away, and let it go, because he was looking at me like the work was what counted, and the work was the most real thing I had. "I don't care one bit whose daughter you are," he told me when he walked me to my car. And I believed him. He proposed in the hangar, which was perfect because that's the spot where I feel the most like myself. No string quartet, no rooftop, no ring some personal shopper had picked out. He'd cut the band himself on the lathe in the back, plain titanium, a little off at the seam, and he was more nervous than I'd ever seen him. "I can't hand you the life they lined up for you," he said, "but I promise I'll never make you feel small." I said yes before he even got the words out. Telling my family was a whole different beast. I gave them about 10 weeks of warning, the way you'd warn people before you set off a controlled demolition. My sister Chelsea heard within the hour and immediately posted to her 180,000 followers a photo of a wrench with the caption, "Bold move, hoping love pays the power bill," followed by a laughing face. Bennett Shaw, the man my dad had handpicked for me, went around telling everyone he'd dodged a bullet. My mother called and just breathed into the phone for a solid minute before she managed to speak. And my father, when he finally got around to calling, didn't raise his voice at all, which with him was always the worst sign. "You want a wedding?" he said. "Fine, I'll throw you a wedding you'll never forget." I should have caught the threat wrapped up inside that so-called gift. I didn't because I was happy, and being happy makes you way too generous toward people who haven't earned it. I told Nathan what my dad had said, figuring he'd get worried. He just nodded slow, like a man glancing at the sky before a flight he's planning to take no matter what. "Let him put together whatever he wants," Nathan said. "We'll still be married when it's over." That calm should have told me something about the man I'd actually agreed to marry. It didn't. Not yet. My mother showed up 2 days later carrying a folder of bridal magazines and a face she'd arranged for mourning. Vivian Calloway does sorrow the way other women do their makeup, with patience and really good lighting. She never asked if I was happy. She asked what people were going to say. "Do you understand what this does to us?" she said, dabbing at a perfectly dry eye. "Your father put 25 years into this name. You're tearing the whole thing apart for a man who smells like motor oil." I told her motor oil was a smell I'd come to love. She set the magazines down like they'd offended her. "Don't force me to pick a side, Meredith," she said. And there it was, the exact line she'd used my entire life, the one that always meant she'd already picked and wanted me to feel guilty for even noticing. I squeezed the brass calipers in my bag until the ridged edge dug into my palm, because Roy used to tell me a measurement doesn't care how you feel about it, and neither should you. "You picked your side a long time ago, Mom," I said. She flinched, and for a half second something genuine moved behind the act. "Your grandfather," she started. "Before he passed, he told me. He asked me to make sure you," and then she stopped cold, "the way you slam a drawer you never meant to open." "Never mind." "Make sure I what?" I asked. "It doesn't matter now." She scooped up her magazines and her grief and left. I sat there a long while afterward, turning that half-finished sentence over in my hands like a part that didn't match anything I'd ever assembled. Roy had asked her to make sure of something about me, and she'd decided I didn't get to hear the rest. The first card got declined at a fabric shop of all places while I was paying for swatches. Then the second one. Then the small advisory stipend I earned consulting for the family foundation just stopped. No email, no phone call, just a balance that dropped to zero overnight. By the end of that week, my father had yanked back every thread that traced to him, the way you'd have a car repossessed at midnight so the neighbors don't catch it. The society crowd slipped away without a word, which honestly stung worse than if they'd slammed the door in my face. A text from a woman I'd known since prep school. "So sorry, hun. You get it right? My dad works with your dad." Another one. "Nothing personal." Almost 3 decades of birthday parties boiled down to a line item somebody chose to cut. Here's where my father misjudged me, and it's the same thing arrogant men always get wrong. He figured that cutting off my money was the same as cutting off my legs. I didn't cry in that fabric shop. I drove home, opened a spreadsheet, and did what I'd been trained to do my whole life, which is run the numbers before you let yourself panic. Rent, groceries, the modest savings I had, the consulting jobs I could go chase that had nothing to do with the name Calloway. The math was tight, but it held. Nathan found me at the kitchen table that night and gently offered to cover all of it. I told him no, and I meant it. "I need to stand on my own feet first," I said. "Then I can stand next." He didn't push. He just rested a hand on my shoulder and let me work. My father had canceled a credit card. He hadn't canceled my hands, or my license, or the brain he'd spent my entire life pretending was just for show. We moved into a little clapboard house near the airfield, the kind of place my mother would have called charming through gritted teeth. Good light, a porch that soaked up the afternoon sun, and a kitchen barely wide enough for 2 people who actually liked each other. I loved it more than any room I grew up in. But Nathan, I was starting to notice, didn't quite add up. He'd take calls out on the porch late at night, voice low, and the pieces that drifted through the window weren't exactly mechanic talk. "Push the maintenance window," he said one night. "No, I'll deal with the board. Don't bring legal in yet." A mechanic doesn't have a board. I didn't ask, because early on we'd agreed we'd earn each other's secrets instead of demanding them. The next morning there was a trade magazine sitting on our table, left behind by one of his coworkers. And the cover story was about an aviation company I'd only half heard of, with a headline about its famously private founder, the billionaire who still liked to get his own hands dirty on the engines. There was no photo of his face, just a gloved hand resting on a turbine blade. I glanced at it, figured it was a nice little story about somebody else, and poured my coffee. Nathan watched me from the doorway with a look I couldn't quite read, somewhere between hope and dread. Like a man waiting to see if you'll crack a code he lost the key to years ago. "Money's just a tool, Mur," he said, almost to himself. "I'd rather you trusted the man than the toolbox." I laughed and told him he sounded like a fortune cookie. He smiled, but he didn't laugh. And later I'd realize he'd been handing me the truth out loud the whole time, and I just hadn't learned how to hear it yet. Let me stop here for a second, because if you've ever been told your choices were an embarrassment to your family, you already know exactly how this part feels in your gut. I read every single comment, so tell me, has anybody ever tried to measure your worth in dollars and decided you came up short? Stick with me if you want to watch this thing turn all the way around, because the moment my father's face finally cracked is coming, and I promise you it was worth the wait. Back to the story. We'd planned something tiny. A little chapel by the water, 40 chairs, just the people who'd actually shown up for us when it counted. We pulled into the lot and found it jammed with cars that each cost more than the chapel itself. My father had invited 175 people from his world, none of them welcome, and he'd seated them himself. He'd even had a seating chart printed up, a thick cream card on an easel by the door. When I finally found the table for my own family, I understood the message loud and clear. He'd stuck Nathan all the way at the back, right next to the emergency exit, under a little hand-lettered sign that read, "Guest, not groom." Guest. The room smelled like expensive perfume and quiet contempt. Bennett Shaw was there, leaning on a column with a glass of something amber, watching me like a man eyeing a deal he was still hoping to rescue. My mother sat up front in funeral gray. Chelsea had her phone up before I'd even finished walking the aisle, filming, murmuring commentary to her followers. I found Nathan by that back exit, exactly where the chart had exiled him, and he was the calmest person in the entire building. "Your dad really has a taste for theater," he said quietly. "He does," I said. "He always saves his big speech for the end." We got married anyway. The vows were ours, plain and honest, and for about 90 seconds the whole machine my father had built just fell away and it was only the two of us. One tired, efficient, and the water past the windows. Then I heard it. That small, bright ring of a knife tapping crystal. I turned, and there was my father standing up at the head of a table he'd crowned himself master of, lifting a glass, clearing his throat, smiling like a man about to do us all a tremendous favor. "A toast," my father said. And the room went obediently quiet because that's what rooms do for men like him. "To my daughter, and to her," he paused, really savoring it, "husband." The pause did the work an insult would have done. "I built everything we have out of a single motel my own father managed to lose," he went on, pacing now, glass in hand, the governor's wife watching from a table nearby. "Every dollar, every door, all of it earned. And I had one hope, that my daughter would carry it on with somebody worthy of the name." He stopped right beside Nathan, looked down at him, at the clean but ordinary suit, at those careful hands. "Instead, she went and picked up a grease stain for the family name." A few people laughed. Phones came up. I felt Chelsea's camera swing toward me, hungry. "So let me make myself useful," my father said, turning to face his audience like a man announcing wonderful news. "As of today, Meredith is no longer a Calloway in any way that counts. No inheritance. No trust fund. Not one share of anything I've built. She's a mechanic's wife now, and she can go enjoy the life she chose." He let it settle. The whole room held its breath, waiting to see if I'd fall apart, which is really the only entertainment people like the ones he'd invited care about. My mother touched an eye and said nothing, defended nothing. Did the exact thing she always did, which was perform the wound while quietly handing over the knife. I didn't break. I stood up straight, the way Roy taught me to stand when a load is heavier than it looks, and I let my father finish his little show, because I'd figured out a long time ago that the loudest man in any room is usually the one with the least left in the tank. Then Nathan stood up. He did it slow, the way he did everything, like a man who'd never once let another person's panic rush him. He buttoned his plain jacket and faced my father across that ridiculous room. And he smiled. That smile was the thing that sent a chill down the back of my neck because there was no anger in it. It was patient. "Thank you for the toast, Mr. Calloway," he said, and his voice carried without him even trying. "And thank you for the inheritance speech." My father waited for begging. "We don't need it." 4 words, plain as a torque setting. The room rustled. My father laughed too loud. "You don't need it, you rent a hangar." "I do," Nathan said. "Best money I spend." "And what exactly do you think you bring to my daughter's life?" Nathan considered it seriously, like the question deserved it. "Respect," he said, "and the truth when she's ready for it." Over at a table by the windows, an older man in a quiet, beautifully tailored suit stood up and dipped his head toward Nathan, just slightly, the way you'd salute a captain. I'd learn later that he ran Nathan's company day to day. My father didn't know him from any other guest, and for one flickering second, all my father's certainty wobbled. The tiniest hairline crack running through all that polished stone. The look of a man who's miscounted something and can't yet spot where. People with our name don't marry mechanics, my father said again, grabbing for the line like a handrail. Nathan just nodded, agreeable, almost kind. You'll understand my work soon enough, sir, he said. Everybody does eventually. Then he sat back down beside me, took my hand under the table, and squeezed it once. And for the first time all day, I felt the room getting ready to belong to us. My father had taken his shot. Now it was mine. I didn't grab a glass or a knife to tap on it. I just stood up and faced the crowd he'd stacked against me. My father believes a person is worth whatever they inherit, I said. I used to believe it too. I spent almost 30 years trying to be valuable to him. I let that hang. I went to the right schools, I learned the right smile, and the most he ever called my work was a hobby. Somebody shifted, uncomfortable. So I paid for my own degree on nights he never knew about, and I learned to build things that hold real weight. The kind that doesn't care what your last name is. I looked at my mother, who couldn't look back at me. Today I didn't lose a family, I just stopped auditioning for one. There was a silence, and then from somewhere near the middle of the room, one pair of hands started to clap. Then another. Then a surprising number of them. Not everyone, but way more than my father expected, including, I noticed, a good few of his own guests. People who maybe had spent their own years auditioning for somebody. The door's right over there, I said gently. If you came here for a tragedy, I'm sorry to let you down. This is a wedding. Stay and celebrate or go. My father's jaw worked. He'd built an entire room to watch me crumble, and the room had quietly, stubbornly refused to watch. About 30 people picked up their things and left. More than 140 stayed, which was the one outcome he hadn't planned for. Because men who only understand leverage never understand that some people respond to dignity. And dignity, it turns out, is contagious in a way contempt never manages to be. My father left then, my mother trailing after him, Chelsea pausing only to film the centerpiece like it had personally wronged her. The second the door shut behind them, the whole room let out a breath. All that pressure that had been squeezing everyone for an hour just lifted, and the strangers who'd stayed slowly, then warmly, started acting like real wedding guests. Somebody got the music going. The caterer, a local woman my father hadn't hired, brought out a sheet cake from a bakery in town, white with a slightly crooked line of buttercream, and it was the best cake I've ever had, partly because nobody at that table was performing a single thing. Nathan and I danced badly in the cleared space between the chairs. Any regrets? He asked, chin resting on top of my head. Not 1 second of it. Even the seating chart, especially the seating chart. He laughed for real that time, and then his face went quiet. When the time's right, he said, I'm going to tell you everything, about the work, all of it. I pulled back to look at him. Why not now? Because you'd hear it differently now, he said. And because I want to be standing somewhere that proves it, not just saying the words. I let it go, because I trusted him, and because the music was good and the cake was gone, and for one whole evening nobody was measuring me against anybody else. I had no idea that the place Nathan wanted to be standing when the truth finally came out would be a stage in front of hundreds of people, and that the very worst seat in the house would end up belonging to the man who'd spent the whole afternoon deciding where everyone else got to sit. 2 weeks after the wedding, a lawyer I'd never spoken to called and asked if I could come by her office. Her name was Alina Whitfield, and she'd handled my grandfather Roy's affairs for more than 25 years before he passed. Her office smelled like old files and lemon cleaner. She slid a thin folder across the desk toward me. Your grandfather left specific instructions, she said. Certain things were only meant to reach you once you married a person you picked yourself, without your father signing off on it. You met that condition 2 weeks ago. Inside the folder was one object wrapped in soft cloth. I knew the weight of it before I ever pulled the fabric back. Roy's good set of brass calipers. The nice pair, the ones I'd watched him use 1,000 times, the match to the worn set I already carried around. Under them was a letter in his neat draftsman's handwriting. He wrote that a year and a half before he died, Alina said quietly. He asked your mother to pass it to you. She brought it back to me last spring, still sealed, and told me to keep it that way. I read it twice. Roy had wanted me to have his old machine shop, the cinderblock building tucked behind the original motel, the place where he'd first taught me how to measure a thing right. And there was more. He'd left me a 15% stake in a small structural components outfit he'd quietly funded years back. A company that, the letter noted in his blunt way, had licensed that little vibration bracket I'd sketched in high school and never bothered to think about again. My patent. The one I'd filed as a broke college kid and completely forgot. Has it been making money? I asked. Elinor's mouth twitched. About 5 years now. So here's the solid thing I want you to hang on to, the way I gripped those calipers in that office until the metal went warm in my palm. My grandfather had handed me a workshop, a piece of a real company, and a slice of my own teenage cleverness. And my mother had buried every bit of it, locked in a lawyer's drawer for almost a year. I didn't rattle off the numbers to Nathan right away. I wanted to sit with them a while, the way you study a structure before you trust your weight to it. The Callaway name had shut every fancy door in the state on me. But it turned out the doors I actually cared about were ones the name had never touched. A marina needed a failing dock looked at. A community college wanted its old gym checked for a new roof load. A small developer in the next county hired me on a Tuesday and sent 2 friends my way by Friday. Solid work done right travels by word of mouth in a way no last name can ever buy. Then I drove out to Roy's old shop. I unlocked it for the first time in years and stood there in the cool dark with the smell of cutting oil still baked into the walls. His tools were right where he'd left them. I called up the components company he'd funded, introduced myself as the engineer behind the bracket, and listened, a little stunned, while a polite man walked me through how many bridges and parking decks were now using my forgotten high school sketch, and what 15% of 5 profitable years came out to. It wasn't a fortune by my father's yardstick. By mine, it was something a lot better. It was freedom I'd built with my own head, the same head my family had spent 3 decades writing off as a hobby, and it had been quietly cutting me checks the whole time they were busy deciding I was worthless. Turns out, I told Nathan that night, finally, the thing they called a waste of time has been earning behind their backs for years. He grinned, that slow grin of his. Sounds like you never needed rescuing. I never did, I said. And the strange part was, saying it out loud, I realized it had been true the whole time. The story stayed in the trade press all month, and even my father couldn't keep it off the business pages. Callaway Resorts was about to open its crown jewel, a billion-dollar flagship further up the coast, and the entire pitch hung on one line stamped across every brochure. Private jet straight to your suite. No terminal, no waiting. The kind of smooth, invisible luxury that only the very rich pay a premium to never notice. That promise lived or died on one exclusive partner, the company that would own the airfield, the fleet, and the whole operation behind it. The name printed in every article was AITA Aviation Group. I read it the way you read a word you've seen somewhere harmless, on a hangar sign, in a headline. And underneath it was the detail every reporter kept circling. My father had been chasing AITA's signature for close to 2 years, courting a chairman so private that not a single one of them had ever met him in person. The contract was supposedly days from closing. Without it, the flagship couldn't deliver the one thing it had already sold to a waiting list of billionaires. That evening, Nathan came in from the porch, and somewhere across the field, a jet powered up, that low-climbing whine I'd loved since the day we met. For half a second, the sound and the name brushed up against each other in my head before I let them drift apart again, because the idea was just too big to hold. Long day, I asked. Couple of contracts, he said, hanging up his keys. One big one finally coming to a head. I told him I'd been reading about my father's resort, about the aviation partner he couldn't seem to land. Nathan poured 2 glasses of water and said, mild as anything, "Is that right?" and steered the conversation somewhere else. And I let him because I still hadn't learned how to add. Quick pause, because this is where it gets good. My father spent close to 2 years chasing a partner he was never even allowed to meet, while that same partner ate breakfast at my kitchen table and scrubbed jet fuel off his hands in my sink. If you've ever watched a proud man march straight into a wall he built himself, brick by brick, stick around. Tell me in the comments if you saw it coming. Now, the grand opening. Nathan sat me down on the porch that Sunday, 2 coffees and a long stretch of quiet before he said anything. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I'm probably going to do it badly because I've never had to do it before." I waited. "The hangar is real," he said. "I fix engines because it keeps me honest and it's the only place my head finally shuts up, but it isn't all I do." "I figured," I said, and he almost smiled. "I'm not poor Murr. I'm the exact opposite of poor, in a way that's hard to explain over coffee." He turned his cup slowly in his hands. "I built a company out of one airframe and a lease I couldn't afford. It grew. It grew a lot. And at some point I stopped letting anyone photograph my face because the second people find out what you're worth, they quit telling you the truth and start selling you a version of themselves." He looked at me. "I needed to know somebody could love me before they ran the math. You did. You fell for a mechanic. You have any idea what that's worth to a man like me?" I thought about the late calls on the porch, the way the pilot straightened up around him, the magazine cover with the gloved hand on the turbine. Pieces I'd refused to assemble because the whole picture was too big for our little kitchen. "Are you about to tell me the name of your company?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "I want you to see it, not hear it. There's an event in 6 weeks. I want you on my arm. You'll understand everything the second we walk in." He reached into his jacket and set an envelope on the table between us. Heavy cream stock, gold pressed into it. The invitation inside was for a grand opening, and the host listed at the bottom wasn't Callaway Resorts at all. It was the aviation partner my father had been begging for 2 years to meet. "I never lied about who I am," Nathan said softly. "I just didn't hand you a price tag." I didn't sleep that night. I lay there listening to Nathan breathe and finally ran the arithmetic I'd been ducking for months. At 2 in the morning I got up, sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, and searched the name on the invitation. Highpoint Aviation Group. Founder, chairman. The results were a wall of the same maddening sentence. Reclusive, private, has never appeared in public. One profile called him the billionaire who still turns his own wrenches. And there it was again, that photo of a gloved hand resting on a turbine blade. No face, just a hand I had watched do that exact thing 100 times in a hangar that smelled like home. I sat very still. The coveralls that read Red Wing, which one quick search now told me was a Highpoint subsidiary. The cash. The way pilots snapped to attention when he walked the line. The board. A man doesn't casually reschedule an airline's maintenance window with one sentence on a porch unless, in some very real way, the airline is his. I thought about my father in his glass tower, 2 years deep into chasing a signature, never once allowed to see the face of the man who held the pen. And I started, quietly in the dark, to laugh. Not a cruel laugh. The kind you let out when a huge structure you couldn't quite see finally snaps into a shape that was obvious the whole time. My husband was the chairman. My father had spent 2 years on his knees, in the most expensive way a powerful man can kneel, begging the very person he'd called a grease stain at my wedding. I closed the laptop. I didn't wake Nathan. I sat with it until the windows turned gray. And somewhere across the field, a jet powered up for an early run, that climbing whine. For the first time, it didn't sound like music to me. It sounded like a countdown. My family, smelling the opening of their flagship and a chance to tidy up the family image before the cameras showed up, made one last coordinated push. Bennett Shaw, still bruised over losing out to a mechanic, started a quiet little campaign in the right circles. The kind that travels on cocktail napkins. Nathan was a gold digger, he hinted. A grease monkey who'd married up and gotten lucky. It was a slick lie, and it was pointed at exactly the wrong man, though Bennett had no way of knowing that yet. Chelsea, never one to let a trend go unmonetized, reposted her old wedding footage with fresh commentary, squeezing my father's toast for laughs from an audience that grew by the day. She had no clue she was passing around the very clip that would soon turn and bite her father's name in half. That's the thing about people who film everything. They never picture the footage swinging back around to face them. And my mother called, sweet as poured syrup, to tell me there was still time. "Your father hasn't formally changed the will," she said. "If you come home before the opening, before the press, we can put all of this behind us. People are talking, Meredith. Not, are you happy? Not, I'm sorry I hid your grandfather's letter for a year. Just, people are talking, and the cameras are coming, and you're a smudge we'd like to wipe off before the photographs." I held the phone and felt the old pull, 30 years of wanting her to pick me. And then I felt it come loose, because I finally understood it had never been a choice she was capable of making. "I'll be at the opening, Mom," I said. "Just not the way you think." She heard that as a yes, as a daughter finally coming home, and she hung up pleased. I let her. Some people only hear the version of you that's convenient, and there's no sense correcting them before the proof shows up. Here's the part I'm proudest of, and it has nothing to do with my husband. A few days after my mother's call, my own firm got an email that made me set my coffee down. The general contractor on the flagship resort needed a structural engineer of record for the signature overwater pavilion, that cantilevered glass room hanging out over the surf that filled every brochure photo. A colleague had recommended me by name, not knowing or caring that the resort was my father's. I drove up, walked the steel, and found 2 connection details I wouldn't put my stamp on without fixing, which meant the most photographed room in my father's billion-dollar dream couldn't legally open to the public until my signature went on the drawings, and my signature went on nothing I hadn't checked myself. Sit with that for a second. The daughter he'd erased held the one stamp his grand opening couldn't happen without, and she'd earned it with a license he'd refused to put a single dollar toward. I want to be clear about what I did with it, because it's the whole point. I didn't threaten to hold it back. I didn't use it as a weapon. I did the work correctly, the way Roy taught me, and I signed the details that were sound, because I'm an engineer before I'm anybody's daughter. A building doesn't care about your family drama when it's holding people 50 feet above the water. But I'd walk into that opening not as a disowned daughter sneaking in on her husband's arm. I'd walk in as the engineer whose name was on the load calcs for the very room they'd be sipping champagne in. "I'm not going as anyone's wife," I told Nathan that night. "I'm going as the person who certified his building won't drop into the ocean." He looked at me a long moment, then nodded slow, the way he did when something made him proud enough that words would only get in the way. The night before the opening, Nathan and I had the only real fight of our marriage, and it was a quiet one. "You should have told me sooner," I said. "I know. 2 years he chased you, you let him." "I let the business decide who it works with," he said. "Your father got the same answer everyone gets who treats people like inventory. He just never knew it was me giving it." I was angry, and underneath the anger was the harder thing, the feeling of having been handled, however gently. "There's a difference," I said, "between protecting yourself and keeping me in the dark." "There is," he agreed, and he didn't defend himself, which is the only thing that ever cools me down. "I hid what I had, I never hid what I felt. If that's not enough, tell me now." It was enough. I knew it was enough, the way you know a structure is sound, not by feeling it out but by checking. "Tomorrow," I said, "we don't humiliate him." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "I mean it, we don't twist the knife, we don't put on a show." "Then what do? "We just stop hiding," I said. "We let the truth stand up in a room full of people and speak for itself. That's enough. It's always been enough." He was quiet a moment, then reached over and turned Roy's calipers in his hand, the worn pair I still kept by the bed. "Roy would have liked you tonight," he said. "Roy," I said, "would have liked you, period. He started out a mechanic too." Nathan smiled at that, and we let the fight melt into the dark. I lay awake a long while imagining my father's face when the chairman he'd begged for 2 years finally walked into the light. And I made myself a promise that whatever I felt in that moment, I'd feel it quietly, because the loudest person in any room is always the one who's losing. The flagship was staggering. I'll give my father that. They'd built it right into the dunes so it looked like it was floating. And the overwater pavilion, my pavilion, glowed out over the dark surf like a lantern. 450 guests, a governor, investors with their own foundations, reporters with press badges clipped to silk, and near the entrance on an easel a seating chart. Of course there was one. My father couldn't throw a party without ranking everybody in it. I scanned it the way I'd scan the one at my wedding and stopped on a single line near the center of the room. Chairman's table, High Point Aviation Group. 4 chairs, conspicuously empty, held for a man my father still believed he was about to finally meet and dazzle. Nathan's hand rested warm at the small of my back. I'd worn black, clean lines, no apology, and the brass calipers were in my little bag, because I didn't go anywhere important without them anymore. My father spotted us from across the room and came over fast, already smiling, the smile he saved for closing deals. And it hit me with something close to wonder that he thought my mother had been right, that I'd come home, that the disowned daughter had crawled back just in time for the photographs. "Meredith," he said warmly, loud enough for the people nearby. "I'm so glad you came to your senses." He gave Nathan the barest nod of civility. "Surprised they let your husband pass the valet." Nathan said nothing, just that patient half-smile. Above us, a recording of a turbine powering up started to swell through the speakers, the open of the program, that climbing whine I knew in my bones. The lights dropped, and the master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone and said the sentence my father had waited 2 years to hear. "Tonight, for the very first time, the chairman of High Point Aviation Group will appear in person." My father turned toward the stage with the hungry, hopeful face of a man about to meet the partner who'd make his crown jewel real. The screens behind the podium woke up, and a single line of text resolved across them in clean white letters. High Point Aviation Group, founder and chairman. The recorded turbine climbed to its peak and cut to silence. Nathan let go of my hand, gave me one small private look, the look of a man finally allowed to stand where the truth could see him, and he walked up onto that stage. I watched my father's face do something I'd waited my whole life to see and had stopped believing I ever would. It didn't crumble, it emptied. The color just drained out of it, top to bottom, like water running out of a glass. His champagne flute tipped in his fingers and he never noticed it spill down his cuff. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Chelsea, who films everything, lowered her phone for the first time in her adult life and just stared. 450 people rose to their feet in a wave of applause for the famously invisible man who'd finally shown his face. And in the middle of all that noise, my father stood alone and frozen, the one person in the room who couldn't move, because the grease stain he'd named at my wedding was standing under the lights as the most sought-after man in the industry. And the daughter he'd erased was watching from the floor with her hands folded, perfectly calm. The master of ceremonies leaned into the mic. "Please welcome the man who never shows his face," he said. "Nathan Reed." And Nathan, my husband, the mechanic from the hangar that smelled like home, looked out over the wreckage of my father's certainty and started, very quietly, to speak. Nathan's remarks were short and completely professional. He thanked the crowd, gave credit to the people who actually turned the wrenches, and said nothing at all about my family, which was its own kind of devastating. When he stepped down, the room surged toward him. Investors, a senator's aide, a magazine editor, all of them suddenly desperate to know the man they'd been guessing about for years. My father got there first because desperation is fast. "Nathan," he said, hand out, voice pitched warm for the people around them. "This is wonderful. I always told Meredith she had impeccable taste." Nathan didn't take the hand. "About the partnership," my father pressed. "The flagship, our 2 years of conversations. Surely now that he waved vaguely, family, we can finalize the terms tonight." Nathan looked at the outstretched hand, then at my father's face, and answered at a volume calibrated to carry just far enough. "I got your proposal, Mr. Calloway," he said. "Months ago, I turned it down." "But why?" "It's the obvious deal. Because High Point doesn't partner with people who treat their own family like inventory to be written off in front of a crowd." He said it without any heat, which somehow made it land harder. Behind him, on the easel my father himself had insisted on, the chairman's table sat with Nathan's name on the little card, plain and undeniable, 4 empty chairs that had been waiting all night for the man my father called a stain. And here's the measurable part, the piece that turned a bad moment into a real reckoning. Without High Point, there was no private jet to the suite, no fleet, no airfield operation. My father had presold that exact experience to a waiting list of the wealthiest guests in the country, and now he had a billion-dollar building and nothing to fly into it. "You had a chance to welcome me," Nathan said. "You picked a microphone instead." My father turned from Nathan to me, and now the deal-closing warmth was gone and the old fury was climbing up in its place, the heat he'd always used to fill a room. "You did this," he said, low and shaking. "You planned it. You let me stand up here." His voice climbed, heads turning. "You humiliated your own father in front of hundreds of people." This was the moment my whole life had been bending toward, and I'd promised myself I'd meet it quietly, because the loudest person in the room is always the one who's losing, and tonight that wasn't going to be me. I opened my little bag and took out Roy's brass calipers, worn smooth from 40 years of his hands and a few of mine, and I held them up where the light caught the metal. "You know what these are, Dad?" He stared, not getting it. "They were Roy's, your father's, the man who started everything you own in a machine shop with grease under his nails." His jaw tightened. "You stood up at my wedding and said Callaway's don't marry mechanics." I let the calipers turn slowly in my fingers. "The first Callaway who ever mattered was a mechanic. You just spent your whole life pretending you weren't his son." The crowd had gone very quiet. A reporter's recorder was up. My mother had stopped performing and gone pale and real. "You said no inheritance," I went on, even and unhurried. "Good, I was never going to inherit you, I was going to outbuild you." And then, because it was true, and because he needed to hear it from the daughter he'd called decorative, I told him the one thing that pulled the floor right out from under him. "By the way," I said, "that overwater pavilion you'll be photographing tonight, it doesn't legally open without my engineering stamp. I signed it this afternoon. You're welcome. I do good work, I always did." The fallout moved faster than my father's PR team could. By the time the valets were bringing cars around, Chelsea's old wedding clip, the one she'd reposted for laughs all month, was making the rounds again with brutal new context. Here was a man calling his son-in-law a grease stain. And here was that same son-in-law revealed as the chairman whose signature the man had spent 2 years begging for. The internet did what it does. 2 of my father's investors found reasons to slip out early, and one murmured on his way past, "Harlan, we're going to have to revisit terms." The governor's photographer got quietly steered away from the family. Nathan found me near the windows of the pavilion I'd certified, the surf glowing under the glass, and he didn't gloat because that was never who he was. "You okay?" he asked. I thought about the 30 years, the canceled cards, the sealed letter, the room my father had built to watch me break. "I'm better than okay," I said, and I meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the chaos behind us. I leaned into him and said it quietly, just for us. The same 4 words Nathan had used at our wedding when he had nothing my father respected and didn't care. "We don't need it." Only now it wasn't a defense. It was just a fact, the truest one I owned. Because somewhere in the last several months the math had quietly come due. Roy's 15%. My forgotten patent, earning for 5 years. The firm I'd grown on nothing but good work and word of mouth. I'd been standing on my own 2 feet long before I ever learned who Nathan was. And that, more than any reveal on any stage, was the thing my father could never disinherit, because he'd never given it to me. You can't take back what you never had the sense to hand over. My mother caught me by the coat check, and the performance was already running. "Meredith, darling, you have to know I was always on your side. I wanted to speak up at the wedding. Your father, you know how he is. I had to protect yourself," I finished. "You had to protect yourself." She blinked. I didn't raise my voice. I'd promised myself I wouldn't. "Eleanor Whitfield gave me Roy's letter, Mom. The one you sealed away for a year. The workshop, the company, all of it. You hid my grandfather's last wish from me because it might have made me a little less dependent on Dad's approval." Her mouth opened and closed. "You used to say, 'Don't make me choose, Meredith.' I held her eyes. You already chose the day you locked that letter in a drawer. She had no script for that. And for once she said nothing, which was the most honest thing she'd done in years. Chelsea drifted over then, mascara genuinely smudged, and to my surprise the sneer was gone. I didn't know about the letter, she said. And I'm tired, Mur. I've been the good one so long I don't know what I am without it. It was the closest thing to the truth she'd ever handed me, and I felt the pull of it, the old wish for a sister. But a near truth at the finish line doesn't erase the camera she'd held up at my wedding. I believe you're tired, I said gently. I can even forgive you. I just won't hand you the truth again and watch you film it. She nodded and didn't argue. And somewhere behind us, my father was learning in real time what it costs to spend a whole life mistaking a price tag for a person. The flagship opened 3 months late, stripped of the private aviation promise it had been built around, and the waiting list of billionaires quietly found other coastlines. Callaway Resorts survived. My father is too stubborn and too rich to fail outright. But his board started asking questions he'd never been asked before, and the answers were all on video. A man who'd spent 30 years being the loudest voice in every room suddenly found rooms going quiet when he walked in, for reasons that had nothing to do with respect. I kept working. My firm brought on 2 engineers, then a third. Nathan still drives out to the hangar most weekends and comes home smelling like the day I met him. And one evening near dusk, my father showed up at our little clapboard house. Alone. No driver, no watch, no script. He stood on the porch looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Can I?" he started, and his voice caught. "Can I apologize?" I let him stand there a moment, not to be cruel, just honestly. "I don't need the apology, Dad," I said. "I needed it a long time ago, and you didn't have it then." He nodded, taking that. "What I need now," I said, "is for you to mean the next 10 years more than you mean this one sentence." He looked out at the field, at the last of the light, at the daughter he'd tried to erase, standing in a doorway she'd built without him. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, and it was the first true thing he'd said to me in decades. "Then learn," I told him. "Slow, with your hands, the way your father taught you, before you decided you were better than where you came from." I didn't slam the door on him, and I didn't fling it wide open either. I left it where it belonged, cracked, with the terms laid out plain. He could be in my life as a father if he could learn to be one, but never again as the man who held the purse and called it love. There was no big reconciliation, no tearful holiday where everything got forgiven in a single evening, because real things don't mend that fast. And I'm an engineer. I don't trust a joint that bonds too quick. My mother sends careful notes now, testing the distance. Chelsea and I text sometimes, small and ordinary, 2 people learning how to be sisters without an audience. And my father comes by on the odd Sunday and sits in Roy's old shop while I work, mostly quiet, watching my hands. Every now and then he asks me what a tool does, and I tell him, and he listens, which is something he never once did back when I was the daughter he was trying to fix. Roy's brass calipers hang on the wall above my bench now, both pairs, his and mine, catching the last of the light. Nathan's out at the field. I can hear a jet powering up across the water, that low climbing whine that used to sound like music, then like a countdown, and now just sounds like my husband coming home.